The gray horse slammed against the fence rail hard enough to crack the wood, and Lorna Calder didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching months ago, the same week the bank started sending letters with red ink on the envelope. What she didn't know, what nobody in Timber Ridge Valley knew yet, was that the horse everyone called worthless was the only living thing that could smell the truth buried under her own pasture, and that by sundown, a man with a check big enough to erase every debt she owed would be standing in her yard, waiting for her signature. Before we go further, if you've ever had to hold your ground when everyone around you told you to give up, stay with this one. It gets harder before it gets better. Type "ghost" in the comments if you're already rooting for that horse. And if stories like this mean something to you, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Now, back to Timber Ridge. The valley sat high enough in the mountains that summer never fully arrived and winter never fully left. Snow lingered in the shaded folds of the ridgeline through May, and by September the wind already carried the bite of what was coming. Timber Ridge wasn't a town so much as a collection of stubborn buildings that had decided, collectively, not to be blown away. A mercantile with a sagging porch, a bank with a brick facade too proud for the dirt street it faced, a church whose bell had cracked 2 winters back and never been replaced, and a scattering of ranches strung along the only road in or out. Lorna Calder's ranch sat at the northern edge of that road, in the shadow of a ridge locals called Widow's Shoulder, though it hadn't earned that name because of her. It was an old name, older than the town's memory, and nobody could say anymore who the first widow had been. Lorna had lived there 11 years, first as Everett Calder's wife, then, for the last 14 months, as whatever a woman becomes when the word widow gets stitched onto her like a brand she never asked for. Everett had been a quiet man who spoke mostly to his horses and his daughter. He'd died in March of the previous year, a fall from the high trail during a spring storm, the kind of death that gets summarized in one sentence at church and then never spoken of directly again, only around, the way people step around a hole in the floor. He'd left behind a modest herd, a house with a good roof and bad plumbing, and, Lorna had learned in the months since, very little money. That last part still didn't sit right with her, in a place she couldn't name. Everett had never been a spender. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't chase the kind of foolishness that swallowed other men's savings. And yet the accounts at the bank were thin. The credit at the mercantile had been quietly extended past what any reasonable banker should have allowed, and there were entries in his old ledger, small, recurring withdrawals over nearly 2 years, that Lorna had never been able to explain. She'd stopped trying to explain them. It was easier to assume she simply hadn't known her husband as well as she believed, and to fold that unknowing into the larger guilt she already carried, that she should have seen it. Whatever it was, she should have seen it coming, the way a good wife would have. That was the shape her grief had taken, not sorrow, exactly, but a low, constant hum of having failed at the one thing she was supposed to be good at, which was paying attention. Now she had a daughter to raise, 7 years old and sharp-eyed, named Etta, who had inherited her father's habit of watching people longer than they were comfortable being watched. And Lorna had a ranch that was, as of this morning's letter from Wexford at the bank, 71 days behind on interest payments, with a final notice that read, in language stiff enough to have been copied from a legal form, full payment of accrued interest required by sundown, or the bank will be forced to pursue its remedies under the terms of the note. She had read that sentence 4 times over breakfast. Etta had eaten her eggs without looking up, the way children do when they've learned that certain silences in a house are not meant to be interrupted. Lorna had tried, in the months since Everett's death, to keep the ranch running on the strength of habit alone, rising before light, feeding the stock, mending what could be mended with her own hands rather than paying for help she couldn't afford. She had sold 2 of the better horses in the fall, quietly, to a buyer from Bitterroot who hadn't asked questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She had let the second hired hand go before Christmas, though there had barely been enough work left for one man, let alone 2. She told herself these were practical decisions, the kind any sensible person managing a struggling ranch would make. Some nights, lying awake with the wind working at the shutters, she suspected they were also a kind of penance, proof she was trying hard enough to deserve staying. The town had opinions about all of it, delivered mostly in the particular currency of small places. Sympathy offered a little too loudly in church, advice given unsolicited at the mercantile counter, the occasional suggestion. always well-meaning, always unwelcome, that a woman alone with a young daughter and a failing ranch might do better to sell up and move somewhere a husband could be found again. Lorna smiled through these conversations and said little. She had learned that disagreeing only invited more of them. And there was the horse. He'd come to her by way of an argument nobody remembered starting. A dapple gray gelding, a coat that had once been the color of wood smoke and was now dull with neglect, delivered to her corral by a rancher 2 valleys over who'd meant to shoot him and changed his mind at the last second, out of some combination of superstition and pity. The horse had thrown 2 riders badly enough to break bones, bitten a stable boy, and refused, as far as anyone could tell, to be caught, saddled, touched, or reasoned with. The town called him Ghost, not for his color, but because he seemed to belong to nothing, no herd, no rider, no purpose. Lorna had taken him in against the advice of every person who gave her advice, which by that point in her life was most of the town. She stood at the corral fence that morning, watching the horse pace the far rail with his ears pinned, a burlap-wrapped bundle of crushed comfrey and yarrow warm in her hands, and she understood, in a way she couldn't have said out loud to anyone, why she wasn't ready to give him up. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't even kindness, not entirely. It was recognition. She knew what it looked like to flinch at every hand that reached toward you, to trust nothing because trust had already cost you everything once. The letter from the bank sat on the kitchen table behind her, its deadline ticking down with the sun. She had until evening. She didn't yet know that the biggest threat to her family wasn't the number on that letter at all. By mid-morning, word had already reached her that a stranger's carriage had been seen coming up the pass road, polished black, drawn by a matched pair, the kind of rig that didn't belong to anyone in Timber Ridge and never would. Otis Farrow, who ran the mercantile and considered gossip a form of public service, had ridden out especially to tell her, arriving breathless at her gate with his hat already in his hands. "Fellows coming up from the city," he said. "Silas Vane. Railroad money, or near enough to it. Wexford's been talking to him for a week and not saying much about why." He glanced toward the house, toward the corral, toward anything that wasn't Lorna's face. "Word is he's coming with an offer for the ranch, Mrs. Calder. A generous one." Lorna had heard rumors like this before, offers that evaporated the moment anyone asked a direct question. But something about the certainty in Otis's voice made her stomach tighten. "An offer for what, exactly?" "I haven't put anything up for sale. That's the part nobody's clear on," Otis admitted. "But Wexford seems awful eager for you to hear him out." She thanked him for the warning. The warning wasn't quite the right word for what Otis had delivered. It had the flavor of something rehearsed, like he'd been asked to plant the idea gently before the real conversation arrived. She didn't say that to him. She only watched him ride back down the road. And then she stood a long moment at her gate, feeling the day tilt slightly under her. The way a floor tilts before you understand the house is on fire. It was past noon when Jed found her in the barn. She hadn't heard him come in. He had a way of moving that seemed designed not to disturb dust, let alone people. And when she turned from the feed bin, he was simply there, an old man in a coat too heavy for the season, hat pulled low, hands raw and cracked from a life spent outdoors in weather that didn't care about a person's comfort. Jed Larkin had drifted through Timber Ridge for as long as Lorna could remember, taking work where ranches would give it to him, mending fence, breaking colts, doctoring sick cattle, never settling, never explaining why. He'd worked for Everett a handful of times over the years, always quiet, always competent, always gone again within a week or two. "Ma'am," he said, which was as much greeting as Jed ever offered. "Jed." She set down the feed bucket. "You hungry? I can put something together." He shook his head, but his eyes moved to the house, to the road beyond it, in a way that told her food wasn't why he'd come. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low, urgent in a way she'd never heard from him. "Don't sign those papers." She blinked. "What papers?" "Whatever he brings you. The man from the city. Whatever he puts in front of you today, don't put your name on it." His jaw worked, like he was chewing on words he didn't intend to say next. "Not today. Not tomorrow. Not till you've had eyes on the county land record yourself." "Jed, I don't even know what you're talking about. Nobody's brought me anything to sign." "They will." He glanced toward the door again, and for the first time in the years she'd known him, Lorna saw something in Jed Larkin's face that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, she understood instinctively, but for her. "I have to go." There's things I can't say yet. Just don't sign." And then he was gone, out through the side door and across the yard toward the tree line, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to move, leaving Lorna standing alone in the barn with a bucket of feed cooling in her hands and a sentence ringing in her ears that made no sense and somehow, underneath the confusion, felt entirely true. She found Etta on the porch a few minutes later, sitting on the top step with her knees drawn up, watching the tree line where Jed had disappeared with the same still attention she gave to storms building over the ridge. "That was the fence man," Etta said. It wasn't a question. The girl had her own private vocabulary for the people who drifted through their lives, sorted by function rather than name. The fence man, the egg lady, the tall man from the bank who never smiled. That's right. Lorna sat beside her, not quite ready to go back inside to the letter still waiting on the kitchen table. "Is something wrong with our land?" Lorna considered lying. The way parents learn to when the true answer is "I don't know," and that not knowing frightens me more than almost anything has since your father died. But Etta had a way of seeing through comfortable answers, and Lorna had promised herself, somewhere in the long months of grief, that she would not raise her daughter on convenient silences the way her own mother had raised her. "I don't know yet," she said instead, "but we're going to find out." Etta nodded slowly, satisfied by the honesty even without the reassurance, and went back to watching the trees. It occurred to Lorna, not for the first time, that her daughter had inherited more of Everett's watchfulness than his easy warmth, the part of him that noticed things and kept them close, turning them over in private before ever speaking of them aloud. She wondered, with a small ache, what else the girl might have inherited that she hadn't yet had the chance to discover. She didn't have long to sit with it. Within the hour, the black carriage Otis had described came up the pass road and turned, unmistakably, toward her gate. Silas Vane was younger than she'd expected, no older than 40, dressed in a gray traveling suit that had clearly never touched a saddle, with the kind of easy, practiced warmth that men use when they've spent a career convincing people to want what they're selling. He stepped down from the carriage himself, waving off the driver, and crossed her yard with his hand already extended, as though they were old acquaintances rather than strangers. "Mrs. Calder, thank you for receiving me on such short notice." His eyes moved once, briefly, to the house, the patched roof, the sagging porch step, and then back to her face, and he was careful, she noticed, not to let anything show in that glance. He was good at this. That, more than anything he said in the next 20 minutes, told her to be careful. She didn't invite him inside. They stood in the yard, Etta watching from the porch window with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read a room before she's told anything about it, while Vane laid out his offer with the smooth efficiency of a man who had given this exact speech more than once. He knew about the banknote. He knew about the interest deadline. He knew, with an unsettling precision, the exact figure Lorna owed, a number she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone outside the bank itself. He was prepared, he said, to purchase the ranch outright, at a price that would not only clear her debts, but leave her with enough to start fresh somewhere easier. Somewhere with a school for Etta that didn't close for 6 weeks every winter. Somewhere without a mortgage hanging over her like weather. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Calder, because I respect that you've had a hard year." He said it gently, and it was, in its way, a kindness, or wore the shape of one. "This land is an easy country. A woman alone, a young daughter, a debt that only grows. I've seen this story before, and it rarely ends well for the family trying to hold on out of pride. I'm offering you a way out before it becomes a story you regret." He produced a folded document from an inside pocket and held it out, along with a check clipped to its corner, the amount visible enough that Lorna's breath caught despite herself. It was more money than she had seen written on a single piece of paper in her entire life. "The offer stands until noon tomorrow," Vane said. "I understand that's not much time, but the truth is, I have other opportunities in the valley I need to consider if this one doesn't move forward. I'd rather it be you. I think you deserve the chance to walk away from this with something, instead of losing it all to the bank for nothing." He smiled, and it was a good smile, warm at the edges. "All I need is your signature." She looked at the check. She looked at the document, its language dense and formal in a way that made her chest tighten with the particular helplessness of not being able to fully read the thing that would decide her family's future. She looked, finally, at the house behind her, where Etta's small face still watched from the window, and she thought of the bank's letter on the kitchen table, and the 71 days, and the sundown deadline, and Jed's voice in the barn. Don't sign those papers. A warning she still didn't understand and could not, standing here with Vane's pen already being offered toward her, fully justify believing over the very real, very immediate math of her family's survival. I need time, she heard herself say. Something flickered behind Vane's eyes. Not anger, not quite, but a recalibration, the look of a man adjusting a strategy mid-sentence. Of course, take the evening. But Mrs. Calder, the bank isn't going to wait, whatever you decide about my offer. I'd hate to see you lose everything and gain nothing in the process. He left the papers with her. That, she would understand much later, had been deliberate, not generosity, but pressure, a document sitting on her kitchen table overnight like a held breath, its check catching the lamplight every time she passed. Before he left, Vane paused at the gate and turned back, as though a thought had only just occurred to him. Your husband, Everett, wasn't it? I understand he passed rather suddenly. Terrible thing, a fall like that. He said it lightly, almost kindly, but something in the phrasing snagged at her, a question dressed as sympathy. Did he ever mention any dealings with surveyors out this way? Landmen, watermen, anything of that nature? The question was too specific to be idle, and Lorna heard it land somewhere beneath her ribs even as she kept her face composed. Not that I recall, she said. Why do you ask? No reason in particular. Due diligence. He smiled again, that same practiced warmth, and climbed back into his carriage without waiting for her to press further. It was a small thing, a handful of sentences exchanged at a gate, but Lorna found herself replaying them long after the carriage had disappeared down the pass road, turning them over the way Etta turned over things she didn't yet understand. A man interested only in a struggling widow's land didn't ask about surveyors. Whatever Vane wanted from her, it had a shape she still couldn't see, and the not seeing frightened her more than the deadline itself. That evening, after Etta had gone to bed, Lorna sat at the kitchen table with the unsigned papers in front of her and the bank's letter beside them, two documents that together seemed to describe the entire shape of her life. Ruin on one side, escape on the other, and no path visible between them that didn't require surrendering something. She didn't sleep well. Near midnight, she heard ghosts scream from the corral. Not the ordinary complaint of a horse unsettled by wind, but something sharper, more specific, and she went out with a lantern to find him standing rigid at the far rail, nostrils flared, staring toward the northern pasture as though something out there had spoken to him directly. She followed his gaze and saw nothing but dark grass and the black shape of the ridge beyond it. When she turned back toward the barn, her boot caught on something half buried in the dirt near the fence post. A tool, rust-eaten but recognizable, its long steel spike and crossbar unmistakable even in lantern light. A surveyor's landmarking stake, the kind used to drive boundary points in a hard ground. It hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of that. And there was only one person who had been near that fence line since. She didn't see Jed again until 2 days later, and when she did, it was because he wanted to be seen, waiting at the edge of her property near dusk, half hidden in the treeline the way he always seemed to prefer, as though a lifetime of drifting had taught him to keep one boot always in the shadow. She crossed the pasture toward him with the marking stake in her hand. You left this, she said. It wasn't a question. Jed looked at the stake for a long moment before he answered. Your husband ever tell you where the good water on this land comes from? The question caught her off guard. There's a spring in the upper pasture. Ghost won't drink from the trough anymore. He drags me up there most mornings, insists on it. She hadn't thought much of it beyond a horse's stubbornness, but saying it aloud now, next to Jed's question, it settled differently in her chest. That spring don't just feed your trough, Jed said quietly. It feeds half this end of the valley, underground, where nobody's bothered to look. Your husband found that out. Spent near 2 years and every spare dollar he had paying a surveyor out of Bitterroot to map it proper, quiet-like, so nobody'd get wind of it before he understood what he had. Lorna felt something shift beneath her ribs. A door she hadn't known was locked, swinging slowly open. The withdrawals, she said, half to herself. The ones I could never explain. That's your answer. Jed's voice had gone rougher, older. Everett wasn't careless with your money, Mrs. Calder. He was protecting the one thing on this land worth more than all your cattle put together, and he didn't live long enough to tell you why. She thought of every night she'd lain awake convinced her husband had failed her, convinced, underneath that she had failed to notice it happening, that some flaw in her own attention had let their life quietly come apart without her seeing. The guilt had been so familiar by now it had started to feel like a fact about herself rather than a story she'd told herself in grief. She didn't know yet what to do with the possibility that it had never been true. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked. Jed was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, something in his posture had changed. Less the wary drifter, more a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. "Because I'm the one who sold your husband this land, 20-some years back, before you knew him. And I never told him what was under it either, not until near the end, when I saw the railroad surveyors start sniffing around Bitterroot Way and understood what was coming." He looked away, toward the ridge. "I've spent most of my life since making sure nobody remembered I used to own this ground. Didn't want the trouble that came with it. Guess I owe you better than my silence now." She turned the notebook over in her hands, feeling the weight of it differently now. Not the diary of a man hiding something from his wife, but a record of a man racing against time he didn't know he had, trying to secure something for a family he loved in the only language he trusted, which was work, not words. "He never said a word to me," she said quietly. "Not one. I used to lie awake wondering what I'd done to make him keep something like that from me. Wasn't about you." Jed's voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. Man like Everett, he didn't believe in promising something before he could deliver it whole. Figured if he told you half a plan and died before finishing it, he'd have left you chasing a dream instead of a deed. So he kept quiet and worked, and I expect he thought he had more time than he got. He nodded toward the stake still in her hand. "I should have told you the day he died. Told myself I was protecting the valley from men like Vane getting wind of it too soon. Truth is, I was protecting myself from having to explain why I sold your husband land I knew was worth more than either of us let on." Lorna didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the pasture grass between them, carrying the cold, mineral smell she now understood came from the spring itself, rising invisibly beneath everything she'd assumed she already knew about her own home. 14 months of guilt, of believing her husband's silence was a verdict on her own inattention, had just been handed a different explanation, and she found she didn't know yet how to set the old belief down. It had kept her company too long to release easily, even now. "I need to see it," she said finally. "The spring. All of it. Where it rises, how it runs. I can't fight for something I don't understand." Jed studied her for a moment, something like approval settling into the deep lines of his face. "Figured you'd say that. First light tomorrow, then. Bring the notebook." They rode out before dawn, Lorna on her mare and Jed on a borrowed mule, up through the timber where the ground rose steep and rocky before leveling into the high pasture Ghost had been dragging her toward for weeks. In the gray half-light, Jed showed her the place where the ground stayed damp even in the driest months, where a stand of willow grew thick and green out of proportion to the surrounding scrub, where, if you dug a shallow hand's depth into the soil, the water came up clean and cold and did not stop coming. He walked her the boundary Everett had marked in his notebook, matching stake to sketch, sketch to stone cairn, until the abstract lines on the water-stained pages resolved into an actual place she had walked past 100 times without understanding what she was walking on. "There's more of it than shows here," Jed said, crouching at the edge of the widest pool, running underground the better part of 2 miles, by what the Bitterroot surveyor told your husband. Feeds into the low country past Otis's place, though nobody's ever traced it that far official-like. He looked up at her. "Railroad's been buying up land options along that whole stretch for a year now, quiet as they could manage. Your parcel's the one piece they can't get around, on account of the spring rising here first, on your ground, before it goes anywhere else." Lorna crouched beside him, trailing her fingers through water cold enough to ache, and understood, in a way that finally felt whole rather than fragmentary, the entire shape of what had been happening around her for the past year without her knowledge. Her husband's quiet urgency, the bank's strange patience with a debt any other lender would have called in months ago, Vane's carefully rehearsed sympathy, the marked land stake at her fence line. It was not one revelation but the sudden, dizzying alignment of a dozen small things she had misread in isolation. Ghost, tied loosely to a willow branch a short distance off, watched her with his ears forward, calm in a way he rarely was anywhere near people, as though this particular ground was the one place in the valley he had never needed convincing to trust. They rode back down before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Lorna's mind already moving toward the practical shape of a fight she finally understood well enough to wage. She had barely unsaddled her mare when a second carriage, smaller, plainer than Vane's, and considerably more official-looking, turned up the pass road toward her gate. The second complication arrived that same afternoon in the shape of a thin, precise man named Pruitt, Vane's attorney, who came alone this time, without the polish of his employer, carrying instead the flat efficiency of someone sent to close a matter rather than charm it open. Lorna had spent the morning at the county recorder's office in Bitterroot with Everett's surveying notebook in hand. A slim, water-stained ledger Jed had finally placed in her palms the night before, its pages dense with Everett's careful handwriting, sketches of the pasture's contours, notations of depth and flow that meant little to her eye but represented, unmistakably, 2 years of quiet, deliberate work. It named the spring. It marked its boundaries. It matched, almost exactly, the county's own incomplete survey records for that section of the valley, records that, she learned from the clerk, a railroad company's agents had been quietly requesting access to for the better part of a year. But when she brought the notebook home and, hands unsteady, presented it to Pruitt as proof that Vane's true interest in her land had nothing to do with charity, the attorney only studied it for a long moment and set it down with the calm dismissiveness of a man who had expected exactly this. A private notebook, he said, unsealed, unwitnessed, unregistered with this county's recorder, is not a legal instrument, Mrs. Calder. It's a diary. It proves your late husband had a hobby. It proves nothing that would hold up if Mr. Vane's offer were withdrawn and this matter proceeded through the bank instead. He folded his hands. And make no mistake, it will proceed through the bank the moment Mr. Vane's patience runs out, which by my estimate is roughly 48 hours from now. The threat was plain enough that he didn't need to make it plainer. Lorna felt the ground she'd gained in the last 2 days. The notebook, Jed's confession, the fragile shape of the truth assembling itself, threatened to collapse back into the same helplessness that had governed her since Everett's death. It would be so easy, in this moment, to believe she was simply not equipped for this fight. That belief had a familiar shape. It fit her like a coat she'd worn a long time. She thought of Ghost instead, the horse who had spent months refusing every hand that reached for him, who had, 3 mornings running now, allowed her to slip a halter over his ears without flinching, not because anyone had forced him to trust her, but because she had shown up, again and again, without demanding it of him. Trust hadn't been given to her. She had earned it, slowly, the same way she was going to have to earn her way out of this. Then I'll need those 48 hours to be spent properly, she said, and was faintly surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The county clerk confirmed this morning that a formal boundary and water rights survey can be filed and witnessed within that window, if I request it today. I intend to. Pruitt's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalculated. That's your right, of course. Though I'd remind you the bank's deadline doesn't bend for county paperwork. I'm aware. She held his gaze. Tell Mr. Vane I haven't decided anything yet, and tell him I'd like to see him at the county recorder's office in Bitterroot 2 days from now, rather than in my kitchen. If his offer is as fair as he says, it'll hold up just as well in daylight, in front of witnesses, as it does at my table. It was, she understood even as she said it, the first time in 14 months she had set the terms of a conversation instead of simply enduring one. Pruitt left without another word, and Lorna stood alone in her yard afterward, shaking slightly, not from fear, she realized, but from the strange, unfamiliar current of having spoken for herself and meant it. For a moment, before he climbed back into the carriage behind Pruitt, Vane lingered at the gate a second time, studying her the way he might have studied a business rival rather than the grieving widow he'd first approached. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Calder," he said, and there was no flattery in it this time, only a kind of wary reassessment. "Most people in your position take the check. Most people haven't had a reason not to," Lorna said. "I have one now." He nodded slowly, as though filing the answer away for later use, and said nothing further before the carriage pulled away. That satisfaction did not survive the walk into town the next morning. She had gone to the mercantile for flour and coffee, ordinary errands she'd been putting off, and found Otis Farrow unable to meet her eyes as he explained, haltingly, that her credit had been frozen pending clarification of her account standing. Language, she recognized immediately, that had come from the bank rather than from Otis himself. Behind her in the store, two women she'd known for years fell into a silence that was somehow louder than conversation. And she understood, walking back out into the street with her basket empty. That word of Vane's offer and her refusal to sign had already spread through Timber Ridge in the particular, distorted way news traveled in small towns. Not as the story of a widow protecting her family's future, but as the story of a stubborn woman refusing a fortune out of pride, endangering her own daughter over something nobody quite understood. She did not cry until she was well past the edge of town, out of sight of anyone who might carry the sight of her tears back into the same gossip that had already reshaped her decision into a cautionary tale. It was one thing to doubt herself in the privacy of her own kitchen. It was another to feel the whole town's doubt pressing in alongside her own, indistinguishable after a while from the voice in her head that had never fully stopped whispering that she wasn't equal to any of this. She thought, walking the last mile home with her empty basket, that it would be easier, so much easier, to simply sign whatever Vane put in front of her next and let the whispering stop. She did not turn back toward town, though. She kept walking home, toward the ranch, toward the horse who had taught her, without meaning to. That trust rebuilt itself in small increments rather than grand gestures, and toward the daughter who was watching her, whether she liked it or not, to learn what a woman did when the whole world seemed to want something from her that she wasn't ready to give. That night, the bank made good on its own threat. A note arrived by Ryder. Her store credit at the Mercantile was suspended effective immediately, on Wexford's instruction, and a man would come at first light to assess the ranch's livestock for potential seizure pending resolution of the outstanding note. She read it twice at the kitchen table, Etta already asleep upstairs, and understood that whatever choice she made in the next 2 days, she would already be paying for the choice she'd made today. The Bitterroot County Recorder's office was a narrow brick building on the town's main street, its single meeting room barely large enough for the dozen people who crowded into it 2 mornings later. Wexford from the bank, stiff in his good coat, Otis Farrow, and 2 other members of the Merchants' Commission, drawn by rumor as much as business. Silas Vane, composed but watchful, seated beside Pruitt with the check still visible in a leather folio on the table before him, and, near the back, arriving quietly and taking a seat without announcement, Jed Larkin, hat in his lap, eyes fixed on Lorna the way a man watches something he's waited a long time to see finished. Lorna stood at the front of the room with Everett's notebook, the county's newly filed boundary survey, and a folder of water rights documentation the clerk had helped her assemble in the frantic 2 days since Pruitt's visit. Her hands did not shake. She had expected them to. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to anyone's sympathy for a widow, did not mention her daughter, did not once let the conversation drift toward the emotional register that a room full of powerful men might have expected and, in some private way, wanted. A grieving woman they could comfort into compliance rather than a landowner they had to negotiate with as an equal. Instead, she laid out the facts in the order the county's own newly certified survey supported. That the spring on her upper pasture was the source of an aquifer running beneath a significant portion of the valley floor. That her late husband had documented and mapped it years before his death, motivated not by profit, but by protecting his family's future. That Mr. Vane's interest in her ranch was not, as first presented, an act of charitable rescue, but a calculated acquisition of exclusive water rights the expanding railroad line would soon require, and would soon be willing to pay considerably more for than the figure currently sitting in his leather folio. Vane's composure held admirably through most of this. It was only when Wexford, visibly uncomfortable, glanced toward him for reassurance and received none, that the room's temperature truly changed. The quiet, collective recalculation of men who had believed themselves to be the only ones who understood the value of what was on the table. Mrs. Calder, Vane said finally, his voice still smooth but sharper now at the edges. Whatever water rights you believe you possess, they mean very little without capital and infrastructure to develop them. That's precisely what I'm offering. Without a buyer, without the railroad's interest formalized, this notebook and this survey are just paper. They're not just paper anymore, Lorna said. As of this morning, they're a recorded water rights claim, filed and certified by this county, in my name and my daughter's. She let that settle before continuing. I'm not here to fight your interest in this valley's water, Mr. Vane. The railroad needs it. This town could use the money that comes with supplying it. I understand that better than you might think. She placed one more document on the table, a proposed lease agreement, drafted with the clerk's help, offering the railroad direct access to the spring's flow at a fair, negotiated rate for a fixed term, with the land and its title remaining entirely her own. What I won't do is sign away my family's home to a middleman so he can resell what's already mine at a profit he never earned. If the railroad wants this water, they can deal with its actual owner. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Wexford's jaw worked silently, the particular expression of a man watching a scheme he'd quietly benefited from come apart in public. Vane's eyes moved once to Pruitt, seeking an argument his attorney didn't have ready, and then back to Lorna, and something in his face, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it, settled into place. "You understand," he said slowly, "that I could simply walk away, find another source, delay the line's route through this valley entirely, if I choose." "You could." Lorna held his gaze. "But that would cost you more time and more money than this lease will, and we both know it. I'm not asking you to lose, Mr. Vane. I'm asking you to deal fairly instead of quietly." Pruitt made one last attempt to salvage the position, leaning toward Vane and murmuring something about the notebook's lack of an official seal, about the survey's recency making it vulnerable to challenge, about delay tactics that might still be available to them. But Vane, watching Lorna across the table with the particular attentiveness of a man recalculating an opponent's worth mid-negotiation, waved him quiet without looking at him. "You had a survey filed in 48 hours, Vane said slowly. "In a county office that typically takes the better part of a month to process paperwork half that complicated." "How?" "I asked the clerk to prioritize it," Lorna said, "and I told him why. It turns out people are willing to move quickly when they understand they've been asked to help protect something, rather than simply file a form." She let a beat pass. "You might try that approach yourself, Mr. Vane, instead of buying silence." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, but its cousin, moved through the room. Otis Farrow, in the second row, had the grace to look uncomfortable. Wexford did not look up from the table at all. It was Jed, from the back of the room, who broke the silence that followed, his voice rough with disuse, but carrying clearly in the small space. "I sold this land to Everett Calder over 20 years ago," he said, "knowing what was under it, and I kept my mouth shut about it because I didn't trust what men like the ones in this room would do with that knowledge. I was wrong to stay silent as long as I did. But I'll say plainly, in front of all of you now, this woman has earned the right to decide what happens to that water, and I'll swear to the truth of every word in that notebook, under oath if this county requires it." Wexford, cornered now by a room full of witnesses to arrangements he'd clearly hoped would stay private, was the first to fold. He confirmed, haltingly, that the bank would accept an advance against the railroad lease, once formalized, as full settlement of Lorna's outstanding note, rather than pursue foreclosure. It was, more than anything, self-preservation. A public admission of wrongdoing would have cost him considerably more than a renegotiated debt. Vane took longer, turning the leather folio over once in his hands before finally sliding it, unopened, back across the table. "I came here to buy a ranch," he said, with something almost like a rueful smile. "It appears I'm leaving with a business partner instead." He extended his hand, not to close a sale this time, but to open a negotiation on entirely different terms, and Lorna, after a long moment, took it. The weeks that followed were not simple, and the story did not resolve itself in a single afternoon at the recorder's office, whatever the room might have felt like in the moment. The lease agreement took the better part of a month to finalize, with the railroad's own attorneys arriving from the city to review terms, and Lorna, alongside the county clerk and a land attorney she'd hired with her first advance payment, negotiating clauses she'd never expected to understand and now, out of necessity, did. The merchants' commission, exposed as quiet collaborators in Wexford's scheme to undervalue distressed properties ahead of the railroad's arrival, faced their own reckoning before the town council, Otis Farrow among them. Though his role had been more gossip than conspiracy, and he spent the better part of a season making amends to Lorna in the form of restored credit, corrected accounts, and an unusual, persistent helpfulness that she accepted without entirely forgiving. Wexford resigned from the bank by winter, replaced by a younger manager sent up from the territorial office to review the institution's lending practices, a review that, Lorna heard secondhand, turned up more irregularities than just her own account. Silas Vane remained a presence in the valley through the lease negotiations, and something in him seemed to shift the longer he dealt with Lorna as an equal rather than a target. He did not become a hero of the story, and Lorna was careful never to let him become one in her own mind. He had, after all, arrived intending to take advantage of a grieving woman's desperation, and the fact that she had outnegotiated him didn't erase that intention. But he kept his word on every term of the final agreement, paid fairly, and left, eventually, a note thanking her for teaching him, his words, that the most valuable deals were the ones that didn't require anyone to lose. Not everyone in the valley softened toward her the way Otis eventually did. A handful of the merchants' commission never forgave her for the public embarrassment of that morning in the recorder's office, and Lorna learned to live with a certain coolness from that quarter, nods instead of conversation, business conducted with more formality than warmth. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she minded this less than she once would have. There was a particular freedom, she discovered, in no longer needing everyone's approval in order to trust her own judgment. There was a single afternoon, in the middle of all that negotiation and paperwork, when Lorna finally sat down at the kitchen table and read Everett's notebook cover to cover, not as evidence to be marshaled for a lawyer or a lease negotiation, but simply as what it was, the private record of a man working quietly towards something he believed would matter more than he could explain at the time. She found, tucked into the last page, a single line she hadn't noticed before, written in Everett's small, careful hand, dated less than a month before his death. "If I don't finish this in time, I hope she trusts herself enough to finish it without me." She sat with that sentence a long while, the kitchen gone dim around her, and allowed herself, finally, to grieve him properly, not the guilt-soaked grief of the past 14 months, but something cleaner, closer to gratitude. Etta, for her part, seemed to absorb the whole ordeal the way children absorb the large events of their parents' lives, imperfectly, in fragments, but with an instinct for the parts that mattered most. She took to following Jed around the barn in the afternoons, peppering him with questions about fence lines and cattle, and, once, with startling directness, about why he'd waited so long to tell her mother the truth. Jed had answered the girl honestly, as far as Lorna could tell from the kitchen window, and something in that honesty seemed to settle an account between them that Lorna hadn't fully realized was open. Ghost, through all of it, remained closest to her, no longer the rigid, flinching animal who had paced the far rail of her corral the morning this had all begun, but not fully tamed either, not in the way that word usually means. He still startled at sudden movement. He still preferred the upper pasture to the barn. But he came when she called now, without the halter, without coaxing, and on the morning the final lease papers were signed, he stood calm and steady at the fence while she read the settlement figure aloud to Etta on the porch, close enough that the girl reached through the rail to rest her small hand against his shoulder, and he did not pull away. Months later, with autumn settling gold and slow over Timber Ridge Valley, Lorna stood on the newly repaired porch of the ranch house, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands, and watched Etta run barefoot through grass that hadn't been this green in years, chasing nothing in particular, simply running because the pasture was hers to run in. Near the barn, Jed, hired now not as a drifter passing through for a week's wage, but as the ranch's permanent foreman, a title he'd accepted with visible discomfort and quiet pride, was teaching the girl's dog to stay clear of the tack room, patient in a way Lorna suspected he hadn't been with anyone in a very long time. He looked up once, caught Lorna watching, and gave her the small nod that had become, between them, its own kind of conversation. Everett's surveying notebook sat now in a glass-fronted case inside the house, not as a relic of guilt, but as something closer to an inheritance, proof, kept where Etta would see it every day growing up, that her father had spent his last years protecting something he never lived to explain, and that protecting a family didn't always look like the things people expected it to look like. Lorna walked down from the porch and crossed to the corral, where Ghost stood waiting at the rail the way he did most evenings now, without being called. She rested her hand against the warm gray of his neck, and he leaned into it, the way he'd started doing sometime in the last month without her quite noticing when it had begun. She had spent 14 months believing that her husband's silence meant failure, and her own inability to prevent that failure meant something broken in her. She understood now, standing in the low gold light with her daughter's laughter carrying across the pasture and the deed to this land recorded, at last, cleanly in her own name, that she had been wrong about all of it, not just about Everett, but about herself. Her worth had never been the sum of what she failed to see coming. It had been, all along, in what she was capable of building once she stopped waiting for someone else to build it for her. The wind moved through the upper pasture, carrying the faint, mineral smell of the spring that had changed everything, and Ghost turned his head toward it, ears forward, calm. Inside the house, on the mantel above a hearth that finally drew properly since Jed had rebuilt the flue, sat a single photograph in a plain wooden frame. Everett, younger, squinting into sunlight on a day Lorna barely remembered anymore, standing in front of a half-built section of fence with his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back, looking, in the photograph, exactly like a man who believed he had all the time in the world to finish what he'd started. She had almost put the photograph away, more than once, in the raw months after his death, unable to look at it without the accompanying weight of everything she believed she'd failed to see. She kept it out now. It no longer asked anything of her that she couldn't answer. Etta's laughter carried up from the pasture again, sharper this time, delighted about something Lorna couldn't make out from the porch. A rabbit, maybe, or the dog finally catching up to whatever it had been chasing all afternoon. Lorna found she didn't need to know the cause of the laughter to feel the shape of it settle into her chest. Warm and uncomplicated, the kind of sound a house needed in order to become, again, something more than a place people merely survived in. She thought, standing there with her hand still resting against Ghost's neck, of the woman she had been the morning the letter from the bank arrived, the one who had believed, with a certainty that had felt less like a thought and more like a fact of nature, that she was not capable of holding on to anything of real value without a man's steadiness beside her. That woman had not disappeared entirely. Lorna suspected she never would. Not completely. Grief and doubt had a way of resurfacing on quiet evenings even after the fight that occasioned them was long won. But she was no longer the only version of herself standing on this porch. There was another one now, harder one and more her own, who understood that holding on to something worth keeping had never required anyone's rescue, only the stubbornness to stay, and the courage to ask the right questions before it was too late to ask them. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. No rescue, no sudden fortune, no stranger arriving to carry the weight away. It looks, more often, like a woman standing in a small county office, refusing a fortune because it isn't fair, and choosing instead the harder, slower path of keeping what's rightfully hers. Lorna Calder didn't need saving. She needed only the truth, a little time, and the stubbornness to hold her ground until both arrived. If Lorna's story stayed with you, if you found yourself hoping, somewhere around that recorder's office, that she wouldn't back down, let us know in the comments which moment hit hardest. And if you'd like more stories like hers, stories about widows, ranches, and the quiet courage it takes to rebuild a life on your own terms, subscribe and stay close. There are more women like Lorna waiting to have their stories told.